So last year at our conference for our keynote speaker on Saturday night, Kristin Collier spoke about bioethics and beauty. And during that presentation, she alluded to a special relationship between the mother and the child in the mother's womb. And we really wanted her to develop that further for us. And so we're so excited that this year she's come back with that presentation to deliver it to us. So please welcome Kristin Collier, a great friend of CPL's from Michigan University.
Thanks to you all for being here, and thank you to Nicole for inviting me. The title of my talk is Fetomaternal Microchimerism and Relational Biology. I don't have any disclosures. So here are some ambitious goals for our time together. Explain the cellular relationships that exist between mother and child. Number 2, understand and appreciate how the relational biology that exists between mother and child benefits them both. And lastly, discuss the implications of this relationship for medicine and for us as human beings. So yes, these are some specific goals, but also the larger goal really is to have us hear a story. A story perhaps you aren't used to hearing in our modern society, or in bioethics, or medicine. The story is how we are all connected. And not just connected in a social or macro way, but connected in a micro way as well, at and through the level of our cells. This degree of interconnectedness that exists even at the level of our physiology should help us reimagine some big fundamental questions, not the least of those being what it means to be human. So given this, let's start with some stories about relationship. As a Christian person, I'd like to start with stories from the scriptures. I'm reminded that relationship is at the heart of the redemptive historical narrative of the scriptures. In them, we are told of a creator God who makes himself known to his people, who loves and cares for his children through intimate relationship, who is physically present with them and desires that none of them should perish. From the very beginning of the creation of man, God is said to have walked with man. The Genesis account paints a picture of the maker of heaven and earth walking in the cool of the garden with Adam and Eve and speaking to them by name. Thus, from the beginning, we see a God who is anything but distant from mankind. And then later, from the Father, by the Spirit, through the Blessed Mother Mary, Jesus Christ comes forth in the flesh as a child formed in his mother's womb. Through Jesus, the Father enters into a relationship with humanity through his union by the Spirit to his Son with our flesh. This beatific physical union of relationship between the Father and his Son Jesus Christ is a witness of the bond between God and man, both macro and micro, both personal and cellular. Thus, there is a relational, personal, cellular construct in humanity witnessed through creation, which is further testified about and through the incarnation of Jesus Christ. God becoming man, that is to say, one with humanity on both the personal and cellular level, was wrought through a woman, the Blessed Mother Mary, the Theotokos, the God-bearer. It's truly amazing that God himself, the maker of all things, enters into a covenant relationship with mankind in a way that is physical, intimate, and eventually incarnate. As a Christian person, I believe that God is creator and author of all things, including our science. If God is relational in his very person, which he is, and given he is the author and creator of all things, should we then not be surprised that we were created to be in relation with each other and that our health should be ordered around relationship? Even without theological commitments, I think it is becoming obvious to most of us now that we all do better in relationship with others. I don't need to tell this group that we have an epidemic of loneliness right now. and that loneliness has been shown to be just as big of a risk factor for adverse health events such as smoking, for example. And there are other studies suggesting a link between relationship and health as well, such as this one from the Journal of Clinical Oncology, showing that a protective marriage protects you from bad cancer outcomes just as much as traditional chemotherapy. Or this study that was done by researchers looking at what predicted good outcomes of patients who were severely ill with COVID requiring hospitalization. So the researchers wanted to know what was protective of the patients against developing delirium. And for those of you who don't know what delirium is, it's a constellation of symptoms that present as the patient becoming confused or disoriented in the hospital. And it's important to prevent, as it's associated with a whole host of bad outcomes, such as increased risk of falls and predicts even a higher chance of death even 1 year out. So the researchers looked at all the ways that delirium could be prevented, including technological and pharmacologic interventions. But do you know the biggest predictor of a person not developing delirium? It was the presence of a loved one at the bedside. Having another human being at the bedside was the best thing to help prevent a patient from developing delirium. Again, we ourselves, through relationship, can be therapeutic agents. Does this surprise you? Well, I guess it depends on how you view what health is in the first place. If I were to ask you what health is, I wonder how you would answer. Because your answer to this question impacts the answer to one of the most contested questions we have right now, which is, what is healthcare? Is abortion healthcare? Is physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, healthcare? I remember when I asked this question of what is health to a group of our own medical students at Michigan a few years ago. And one woman raised her hand, and she said that she had been an anthropology major at the University of Iowa as an undergrad. And for her senior research project, she did qualitative research asking farmers, what do you think health is? And she said time and time again, the farmers would say things like, I don't consider myself healthy unless the soil on my farm is healthy, the crops are healthy, the animals are healthy, and my neighbors are healthy. And it was this beautiful picture of health that really extended and transcended even individual biological health and really was the picture of shalom. Is this picture of health, of shalom, the one you were taught in medical school, if you attended medical school, or even in your high school health class? Because the more I've thought about a proper definition of health, the more I've come to understand it as right relationship. Right relationship horizontally, like with our bodies, with our food supply, with our neighbor, and right relationship vertically as well, with God or the divine. If this is the case, then every question I asked a few minutes ago, therefore, might not be considered healthcare, as they are all disruptors of right relationship. Physician-assisted suicide and abortion may not be considered healthcare because they disrupt the sacred relationship between healer and patient, and abortion disrupts one of the most fundamental relationships that there is between a mother and her child. That is one of the reasons abortion is so destructive, because it is a destroyer of relationship. Between mother and baby, yes, but also robs grandparents and society of the presence of that member of Homo sapiens who, if had lived, would have had relationships of their own. I once heard someone say that the reason society feels very off and lonely sometimes is that we are literally missing millions of people who would have been here, but they aren't because they've been aborted. And we acutely feel and sense their absence from time to time. Given the emerging evidence that right relationships affect health and are integral to it, what would it look like to approach health as right relationship? Well, it might look like in part what public health experts like Harvard's Tyler Vanderweel have done with asking these types of questions of late, like, is forgiveness a public health issue? As this piece of his states, the evidence suggests that forgiveness promotes health not only in an individual sense, but in a relational and theological sense as well. It's fascinating to think about, right? Or if we had a higher view of relationships and how they matter to patients' health, we probably wouldn't have had such restrictive visitor policies in place during the pandemic, especially once we had vaccines and enough PPE. If you're interested in this topic, I wrote about this tragedy in an op-ed pictured here for America magazine. But relationship is not the framework in which we are taught a construct of health. Maybe we can talk about why you think that is during our Q&A and discussion in a bit, but let's think right now about the alternative view of health we are often taught. What is that view? Well, it's one that reflects the cultural narrative of how we've been taught to see ourselves, solo, autonomous, biological machines, whose main arrival at flourishing comes not in thick relationships of interdependence with others that includes chosen and often unchosen obligations, but instead as people who are taught through various cultural messages that the height of human flourishing is to be unencumbered, self-sufficient, and radically independent. This view of health has its own radical implications for society, public health, and medicine. But before discussing that, let us think more deeply about a paradigm of health as right relationship. And for our discussion here, I've chosen to use the science of pregnancy to explore this. And my goal with this is to present you the not often talked about but beautiful reality of the interconnectedness of the biological and physiological level between a baby and her mother. Then we'll briefly discuss the implications of such a reality, then hopefully together during our Q&A discussion time, talk about how we can re-narrate the culture with stories of health as relationship, as scientists, lawyers, and policymakers. Although much has been written about the bond between a mother and her child in childhood, especially in parenting books, there has been much less emphasis and discussion on the bond that exists between the mother and her child before the baby is born. This is in part because I believe it would be awkward for the pro-choice movement and its agenda to have this reality in the public square, which instead, with every opportunity, attempts to marginalize the reality of the prenatal child's dignity from our moral sphere of concern. But see, the science is now on our side here as pro-lifers. Scientists now have a greater understanding of this bond in part because of developments in prenatal imaging and advances in knowledge of the biochemical nature of both the mother and child as they relate to one another. Science has given us a window into the world of the uterus, a previously mysterious and unknown place. So let's think about the uterus now. So the psalmist writes that each one of us is created in a loving way by God, who knitted us together in our mother's womb. I wonder if anyone here knits. What's involved in that craft? Love, creativity, patience, intentionality, and vision is involved, among many other things. So in the mother's uterus, God is involved in the creation of a person at the cellular level in a way that is active, personal, relational, and physical. And right from the beginning, there is a relational construct illuminated at the level of the cells between a mother and her prenatal child. From the moment of conception, mother and child start to work cooperatively. The first act of cooperation between mom and baby is the building of the placenta, pictured in art here. The placenta is a flattened, disc-shaped organ in the uterus of the pregnant mother that through the umbilical cord nourishes and maintains her prenatal child. Placenta is derived from the Latin word for cake because of its flat, pancake-like appearance, and it weighs approximately 1 pound and is attached to the mother again along the wall of her uterus and to the prenatal child through her umbilical cord. And a normal, healthy umbilical cord contains 3 vessels, 2 umbilical arteries, and 1 umbilical vein, is usually about 2 feet long. And like God's hand reaching out for man as depicted in Michelangelo's art here on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, baby and mother can be thought of as reaching out for one another at a physiological level to build the placenta as both of them contribute to it. Did you know that the placenta is the only purposely transient organ in humans and the only single organ that is created by 2 people in cooperation? It is the only organ in humans that is made by and shared by 2 people in cooperation. And because of that fact, it is what is known as a fetomaternal organ. So the placenta, as many of you know, is the organ through which the mother and the baby interface. In fact, it's the only organ that performs the work of multiple organs and systems, acting as the baby's lungs and kidneys, as well as managing metabolic, thermoregulatory, endocrine, and immune functions. It is truly amazing in these properties, and it also has known properties of healing, like this recent piece I saw in the New York Times describing the healing powers of the placenta. Here's also what's known as a placenta print, where the placenta after delivery is pressed on a piece of paper and then sometimes embellished afterwards with ink or paint, like the slide I showed a couple slides ago. Placenta art is a great conversation starter, by the way, if you hang one on your wall, or is a great gift to somebody who works in obstetrics or with babies. So historically, the placenta has been called an afterbirth, as it's delivered after the baby, and really has long been considered nothing more than an afterthought. This, however, is changing. As part of the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, has a human placenta project with a goal of better understanding this important organ, and to date has granted more than $50 million in research funding to study the placenta. As the NIH website says here, the placenta is arguably one of the most important organs in the body. This is a project that really is studying relationship, as the placenta is formed through relationship and is affected by relationships, not only of the mother to child, but of the mother to others. As we know that stress, for example, between mother and others in her world affect the placenta and put the baby at risk for things like growth restriction, for example. So this study, for example, shows how the mechanisms by which maternal stress confers lasting sex-specific neurobehavioral dysfunction in her child likely initiate within and across the placenta. Again, relationship. And in addition to the creation of the placenta, the interconnectedness between the prenatal child and her mother is intimate and more profound than previously believed. So this is illustrated in what is called microchimerism. So let's think about how this looks by me telling you the story of a mom and baby. So let's start by picturing a woman who has just had a baby prematurely. Let's say a baby boy, and they're pictured here. So the mother has had the baby boy, let's say by cesarean section, and she's post-op and now has a surgical incision that needs to heal. The baby also needs healing, as he was born prematurely and is having failure to thrive, difficulty growing, and trouble regulating his body temperature and respiration. Physiologically, can the baby and mother heal and flourish independently of one another? Of course not. Let's look at the baby first. Now, for one, preemie babies will often not survive and certainly will not thrive without skin-to-skin bodily contact. So in the NICU, in spite of all the techno-pharmacologic innovations that we have at our disposal, one of the most important interventions that helps preemie babies to thrive is skin-to-skin contact of the baby on the chest of another human being. This, as many of you know, is called kangaroo care. It's pictured here. And it's been shown to reduce mortality of hospitalized infants who weigh less than 2 grams by 40%. And our medical students are often shocked when they go up to the NICU for the first time, and they expect to see everything based around biotechnology, but what they instead see as one of the most powerful interventions to help the babies to thrive is seeing babies on the chests of their mothers, fathers, and even the older ladies who volunteer to hold them and talk with them to help them grow. Not only is the holding important, but speaking to them is also therapeutic. Research has shown that preterm infants have less episodes of slowed heart rate and unstable respirations when they hear their mother's voice. So even the sound waves of a mother's voice have healing power for her baby. Is this surprising that health and healing are realized in relationship? Wrongly, we tend to think of functions like heart rate and respiratory rate as purely biological and autonomous functions, but this is not true. This way of seeing is an outflowing, of course, of a larger cultural narrative, again, of how we've been taught to see and sometimes want to see ourselves. Autonomous, solo agents seeking to create our own reality. But the proper paradigm of thinking of our biological reality, though, is one in which we are connected to one another. But what if I told you that this relationship between the preemie baby boy and his mother was not just at the macro level of their bodies, but at the micro level of cells as well? So let's look at mom's healing now. So to introduce this concept, I'd like to know if you know what this is. So this is the chimera of Greek mythology. And so the chimera is the fire-breathing creature that's usually made of 3 distinct creatures, here pictured with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. So in science, microchimerism is the presence of a small population of genetically distinct and separately derived cells within an individual. So we know that genetic material from the prenatal child crosses across the placenta and can be found in her mother's circulation. This DNA is analyzed in some of the prenatal screening tests done to look for chromosomal abnormalities. But the interaction at the level of genetic material, however, between mother and her prenatal child goes much beyond that of a transient crossing of genetic material into maternal circulation, though. So let's look at what this looks like by thinking about how a mom heals after delivery. So let's go back to our marvelous dyad and to our story. So the mother has had a C-section. Let's say her C-section incision has been properly sutured, and her body will respond by sending all the right cells to the surgical site. And the normal, miraculous bodily healing will commence as we know it to happen. But what if I also told you that the baby boy is also helping his mother's wound to heal? And not in some detached way, but directly by the presence of some of his cells in her body. How does this happen, you might ask? Are not the baby and the mother 2 distinct physiological beings of separate cellular material? Not completely, because of the reality of what we know about the phenomenon that is called fetomaternal microchimerism. So we know early in pregnancy, baby cells cross from the baby across the placenta and go into her mother and insert into mother's various tissues and organs and then start acting like the cells around them. This is a biological phenomenon that has been known about for years and occurs early and often in pregnancies and is called fetomaternal microchimerism. So these cells can take on many different roles to aid the mother. These cells have been found in women's thyroid, breasts, and brains. And in our example, the fetal cells from the baby can be found in the mother's wound created by the surgeon during the C-section and are helping the mom create collagen to help her heal her wound. And the baby, through the presence of his cells in his mom, is actively helping his mom heal from her surgery. Isn't it amazing and beautiful that we are relational in our physical beings, even down to the level of the cell? So these cells persist in mom even after the child is born. This is radical mutuality between human beings at the level of the cell, and this is truly beautiful. Why? What does it reflect? Well, real beauty reflects truth, something higher or greater than ourselves. And this example of mom and baby is beautiful because it does reflect a higher truth. The truth that God is the author of all creation and humanity, including our biology, and God himself is relational in his very being. And given the relationality of God and the fact that he is the author of all science, should we then be surprised to find that our very biology and physiology is relational down to the level of the cell? And as I said, the microchimeric cells have been found in various maternal tissues and organs, such as the breast, bone marrow, skin, liver, and brain. And early and late effects of these cells have been hypothesized. Some of these cells appear to target sites of injury, like we talked about, and fetal cells may even be involved in the process of lactation by signaling the mother's body to make milk. Others have been thought to help protect a mother against breast cancer later in life. So this process likely involves some type of negotiation or cooperation between mom and baby at the cellular level. Researchers are still attempting to understand the full function of these cells, but some models suggest that some of these cells continue to aid the mother years after her baby is born and may even influence spacing of future siblings. So the full significance of fetomaternal microchimerism remains unclear, but this relational biology challenges what we've mistakenly believed, that we are biologically autonomous individuals, while instead the reality is that many human beings are walking around with remnants of other human beings in their bodies. Male cells may occur in the blood of as many as 8 to 10% of healthy women without sons, and no history of abortion or pregnancy loss. This may be the result of a phenomenon called the vanishing male twin, or could be the cells that entered her own mother's circulation from a previous carried male child and then entered her own circulation. Because this cellular sharing is not just in one direction, that is from child to mother, but is bidirectional, like any good relationship is, the mother not only carries cells of her son, but her son also carries cells of his mother and can exist across siblings and generations. So identical twins, for example, exchange these cells across their shared placenta. So the end result of these processes is that many of us are interconnected at the cellular level. And so what is truly also amazing to me is that these cells are not inert. It would be one thing to have these cells from another person in your body and for them to do nothing. But it is another thing entirely that these cells become integrated into maternal tissue and are active and working in ways that we are just beginning to understand. This is radical mutuality at the cellular level. And I think about mothers who have lost both prenatal and postnatal children, and how they have longed for their children still to be with them in some way. And now we see from the science that they are. And if you're interested in reading more about this, I've written on this topic here for Notre Dame's Church Life Journal. So the relationship between mother and baby is complex and exists not just at the micro level, but at the macro level as well. So let's think of health as relationship from the perspective of the baby again now. So most of us are probably familiar with research that shows that babies not only recognize their mother's voice in utero and prefer it over all their voices, but research has also shown that the mother's voice has the ability to affect her child's brain structure and is likely a key factor in her child's development of language. So for example, in one study done at the Brigham and Women's Hospital on premature babies, mothers' voices were recorded, singing and reading, and then these recordings were played for hours a day into the intervention group of babies incubators, while the other group received standard of care. So babies who were exposed to their mother's voices had significantly thicker auditory cortices in their brain than those in the control group. The fact that we as humans can be responsible for affecting the thickness of another person's brain by our own loving voices really should make us weep with how beautiful that is. And I think of the idea of co-creation or sub-creation here, and the idea that everything we co-create that is beautiful will be resurrected and present in the new heavenly city. It suggests that the acts of creation, especially when done in partnership with others, have a kind of eternal value or permanence. A mother's voice not only is preferred by her baby above all their voices, but is also likely instrumental in how a baby learns language. One study demonstrated that when a preterm baby heard her mother's voice, not only did the area of the brain responsible for speech recognition activate, but so did the area responsible for language processing. And when the babies were instead exposed to just another female voice, i.e. not their mother, only the area responsible for recognition activated and not the area responsible for language processing. This suggests that a mother, through her voice, is the primary initiator of language in her child. Again, we are just beginning to understand the physiological and biochemical bond between mom and baby, but the fact that mothers' voices affect the size of our children's brains by speaking and singing to them, or how they acquire language, point to the beauty of how we all need and benefit from one another in a way that complements the underlying biology, and really speaks to a wondrous design that works best in a way that is relational. Again, if you are interested in reading more about this, I've written on the effects of mother's voice on her baby, also here for Notre Dame's Church Life Journal. And because relationships are bi-directional, again, the baby exerts an influence on her parents as well. Again, we know because of microchimerism that the baby is present in the form of her cells in her mother, assisting her in ways we are just beginning to understand. Her baby's cells are living inside her brain. And not just living there, but changing the brain matter itself. We know that mothers' brains are also significantly affected by pregnancy. And I like this question that the author poses. Yes, why do we not hear about this more often? And this study that found that pregnancy changed the gray matter in women's brains responsible for an enhanced ability to have theory of mind, which is the ability to attribute emotions and mental status to other people. And of course, men's brains are changed as well. And even later after birth, the fetomaternal bond, which developed between mom and baby in utero, continues, of course. One of the most intimate ways in which mother and baby interact in the postpartum period is through breastfeeding. So lactation and breastfeeding provide also a unique opportunity for bonding between mother and child and have special health benefits for mom and baby. We know that babies in the infant stage, for example, are at increased risk for infection. They are considered uniquely immunocompromised, similar to older adults, because of their relatively weak immune system. And breastfeeding not only provides a unique opportunity for mother-child bonding, but breast milk helps the baby by delivering antibodies from the mother to the baby in order to help protect the baby from various types of infections. Breastfeeding is also believed to reduce the risk of sudden infant death syndrome and may also help reduce the risk of chronic disease in both mother and baby, such as childhood obesity, diabetes, and asthma in the child, and breast and ovarian cancer in the mother. There also appears to be a pain-reducing or analgesic effect associated with breastfeeding, which may be due in part to the maternal-baby bonding that occurs during this process. In fact, breastfed infants experience less stress during painful procedures than formula-fed infants. Again, we are physical agents of healing through our bodies in relationship. And I'd also like to provide you with another illustration of the intimate relationship between mom and baby with a very poignant example. So there is a report, as Abigail Tucker writes about in her fascinating book, Mom Genes, that in one case, the microchimeric cells of a baby into a mother were responsible for rebuilding a whole lobe of one woman's liver, a case made even more poignant by the fact that the baby had been aborted. So these examples provide only small glimpses into the cooperation that exists at both the micro and macro level between mother and child. Their symbiosis serves as a beautiful example of God's relational creation in a way that speaks to interconnectedness, mystery, and beauty. So what are the implications for this as people who care about health? Well, if we have a broader definition of life than one defined in a purely biological sense, we understand that none of us can be fully alive by ourselves. For us to see both prenatal child and mother in all their complexity and meaning, their dignity becomes more difficult to ignore, and their lives that much harder to dishonor. I never remember once, in med school or in each of my 4 pregnancies, hearing about any of this beautiful reality. Why was that? Well, for one, this narrative of interconnectedness and interdependence goes against our often dominant current cultural narrative, one in which the pinnacle of human existence is made to seem like one must become radically self-sufficient, autonomous, and free from unchosen obligations. But remember, autonomy is a myth. Even if we could be fully autonomous, which we can't, why would we want to be? I think here of a fuller idea of health that encompasses instead a sense of flourishing, or what Aristotle would call eudaimonia. And here I'm reminded of what philosopher Alistair MacIntyre has said, that we don't flourish as solo automatons, but instead that we most flourish as humans in networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. And he reminds us that none of us are fully autonomous and instead are on a scale of disability. And we most flourish by being grateful for those people who cared for us when we were dependent infants, and also having anticipatory gratitude for those who will care for us when we become seriously ill or older. And in this network of giving and receiving, we all flourish together in relationship, both in the receiving of help, but also in the giving of help as well. But instead, I think how often the cultural narrative instead frames interconnectedness such as burden carrying for others as something to be avoided, or painted as undignified, or frankly, pathetic. And how this narrative shapes vulnerable and older adults. This is most acutely seen by one of the top reasons people request physician-assisted suicide in Oregon, for example, that they don't want to be a burden to their loved ones. There's nothing in our dominant cultural narrative of unchosen obligations, redemptive suffering, or the gift that comes with bearing the burdens of others. The emerging dominant cultural narrative instead is that our very personhood, and therefore dignity, is premised on the right to be separate, unencumbered beings with no unchosen obligations. Think about how this narrative is reflected in our culture's wildly permissive laws on abortion and physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, for example. So what would it look like to reclaim a dignity of dependence and interdependence? Well, I think of Scripture and how nowhere in the Scriptures is burden-carrying framed in a way that is bad. In fact, instead I think of Simon helping to carry the cross of Jesus Christ, and of this icon of Jesus portrayed as the Good Samaritan, literally carrying the burden of us on his shoulders. This icon reminds me that our human dignity is not fully realized through being a solo automaton, but considering a radical autonomy as the highest good, but that there is a deep dignity in a sense of radical entanglement and, dare I say, mutual dependence with others. Here I think of Gil Mylander's piece from First Things a few years ago titled, "I Want to be a Burden to My Loved Ones." In the piece, Gil talks about how he hopes to grow old in relationship and talks about burdens in a way that rejects the current cultural narrative around burdens. Gil instead frames burden carrying as a privilege. Not that it isn't hard or arduous, but that it's a beautiful privilege to help carry the cross of another. About his wife, at the end of the piece, he writes, quote, "No doubt she will bear the burden better than I would. No doubt it will be only the last in a long history of burdens she has borne for me. But then mystery and continuous miracle that it is, she loves me. And because she does, I must, of course, be a burden to her." End quote. So let's contrast that to the narrative around abortion that we currently see about how the prenatal child is seen while still in her mother's body. And like the most notorious, oft-quoted, and well-known pro-abortion slogan that there is, "My body, my choice." There is no recognition of relationship here, of someone else's body also being entangled intimately with your own, and this is on purpose. While what the reality is this instead. This is your body, and this is the body of someone else. Or this Planned Parenthood tweet, which says, "Everyone deserves the freedom to control their body and life, no matter what." No matter what. No matter who gets hurt, what it costs, or what others think. Again, a view that is absent relationship. But if we instead realize there is another human being, another person involved in the decision to have an abortion, we would instead have more sentiments like this one from this pro-life sister who says, "When our liberation costs innocent lives, it's merely oppression redistributed." Again, there is a victim here in the violence of abortion, but we only recognize this when the prenatal child becomes ingrained in our cultural imaginary as a real living member of Homo sapiens. So the reality of what we've discussed about relationship is an inconvenient truth for our pro-abortion counterparts, and that is why these narratives of mom and baby and their interconnectedness continues to be silenced by them. I'm reminded here of Mother Teresa when she said, "Today, if we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. That man, that woman, that child is my brother or my sister." End quote. Note, she did not say that we are to treat each person like a brother or a sister, but that they are a brother or a sister. If we are to truly belong to one another, there is a claim upon each one that rejects radical individualism. And as I wrap up the formal remarks, I'd like to leave us with some beautiful writing by Leila Bresco, who writes on our theme of interdependence of mom and baby. She says, quote, "A world that holds up independence as the ideal offers us two rival duties: to obscure our dependence and to be resentful of it. No woman can lightly assent to the illusion of autonomy, because a baby is alien to the world of self-ownership. Every woman's citizenship in that imaginary republic is tenuous. A world of autonomous individuals can't acknowledge both woman and child simultaneously. The sheer amount of work it takes to stifle fertility, to put eggs on ice, or pump milk for a baby not welcome outside the home makes it clear that there is something untruthful and sharp-clawed at loose in the world. Fear and hatred of weakness and dependence wound the dependent most, obviously, but are poison to all, even the people who are strong at present. Without repeated reminders that the broken are beloved, how can we remember who God is? End quote. And for those people who are interested, Leah has a book coming out next fall that is going to be titled The Dignity of Dependence for anyone that's interested. So I believe that the beautiful reality of the placenta and fetomaternal microchimerism provide glimpses into the cooperation and interconnectedness that exists at the cellular level between mother and child in the relational biology of mankind, which God has magnificently designed. And the mother-child symbiosis serves as a beautiful example of God's relational creation in a way that speaks to interconnectedness, mystery, and beauty. So what would it mean for us to reimagine health and healthcare in a relational way, framed around a dignity of interdependence? We all are storytellers, and I believe that the power of stories has more potential to shape a society's moral imaginary than the best arguments could ever do. Let us re-narrate the culture with stories of health as a relationship, and not just tell the stories, but live them ourselves, realizing that none of us can be fully alive alone. I look forward to our discussion now in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. One of the reasons that I really wanted to have this talk is because, like Kristin, all through medical school, 12 plus years into practice, 3 babies later, I had never heard of this.
So much to say. So actually, yes, I have a grant in something called narrative medicine, which is how stories can reimagine the vocation of medicine. I'm really interested in medical language, specifically how medical language can serve to dehumanize and to stigmatize patients, especially in the written medical record, but also oral. I'm also very shocked and disappointed and really horrified by the language that we hear, sometimes even the day-to-day work of the hospital around specific people who are on the margin, specifically babies and people who have disorders of the brain. And I always think I think of the baby being compared to a parasite. Even in the Journal of Medical Ethics earlier this year, pregnancy was stated in this very prestigious paper as a pathogen, right? And what is medicine to be pathogen? So again, this language, I just am reminded by someone said that every dehumanizing ideology starts with the same temptation, right? To see the undesirable other as a non-person. So I just want to highlight that one of the most powerful things I think that you can do, even if you are just right in the hierarchy, medical student or pre-medical student or fellow or trainee, to speak about your patients in a way that speaks to their inherent dignity, right? You have power over the way that you speak, and the way that you speak can really highlight who you are taking care of. So about your question about medical education, again, I'm not asking this type of stuff is not me just talking about crystals and chakras, right? We are actually talking about science. Like this should be part of like medical education. Like this is actually the science of pregnancy. And so I think about, there's always a vision of the good, right? There's always a worldview that shapes curricular decisions, and why certain parts of science, this is science, right? Why certain parts of science are left out of curricular decisions is interesting to me. And who benefits, right? Who are the privileged few that are making decisions about curricular decisions, what's included, what's not, and why is this not included when it's part of the science of pregnancy, right? So I think one of the practical ways maybe that we can, as people care about the beautiful reality being sort of witnessed to through medical education and other spaces, is having seats at the table. So we need people of goodwill and specifically pro-lifers to have seats at tables in editorial boards of journals and in medical societies who are shaping consensus statements and in curricular committees, right? To be like, hey, like raising their hand and asking questions as to why things are left out or included or not included. So again, I don't think this is outside of like the imminent frame of medicine. These are actually scientific, real realities that are actually part of the science of pregnancy. But it's not like we're asking to have some fringe thing be included in the curriculum. So I think if you speak a language of like this is science, actually, like as we think about an inclusive curricula, right, that is whole, this should be part of that, in my opinion.
Hello there. Can you hear me okay? I'm Rachel, a second-year medical student. Thank you so much, Dr. Collier, for your amazing lecture. I just had a question about language. So I'm thinking a lot about language these days in terms of even the language of individuals. And I'm starting to kind of push back on that language of individuals because are we really individuals? If we're so relationally interdependent, then maybe a more suitable word would be persons. And so that's kind of a switch that I'm trying to make. You know, another switch would be from healthcare providers to healthcare professionals, for example. And so also, I just wanted to make a note. I saw this incredible book cover. So Stephanie Gray Connors, I was somebody who was previously pro-choice for a number of years. And then finally, I just read a book called by Stephanie Gray Connors about abortion. Her newest book coming out is called My Body for You. And I thought that was so beautiful. And it says it's a pro-life message for a post-Roe world. My Body for You, coming out December 2025. And so I'm just thinking like all these little nuanced language things makes a huge difference. For example, something that I think is unethical is in my medical education, we learn about the fetus, the embryo, and a term that's commonly used is the tissue or products of conception. And I actually think that's a very unethical issue. So I'm somebody who I come from a standpoint of I respect intellectual diversity. And I think that we need to make space for intellectual diversity. So I'm not trying to impose my ethics on anyone. And I say my ethics, not my personal beliefs, because to say my personal beliefs makes it sound very religious and, you know, kind of unique. But no, my ethics. We all have a diverse ethical perspective, and I bring my ethical perspective to the table, and I want other people to do so as well. But what I care about is us talking about the truth, and the truth that you talk about from a biological perspective. So what I care about in medical education is, okay, it's an embryo until 8 weeks, I believe, and then a fetus from 8 weeks until birth. And then we call this, you know, an infant and that sort of thing, or a neonate and then an infant, that sort of thing. And I'm thinking, why aren't we using the truth here? Why aren't we talking about the truth? And actually, so I received a pregnancy termination lecture a few weeks ago that made me quite upset. By the way, we spent 10% of the lecture talking about maternal death from giving birth. Canada. So that felt a little bit funny to me because I know that there can be so many complications related to giving birth, and I know that sometimes, you know, giving birth can be dangerous, and I recognize that. But what it made it seem like is that giving birth is pathological, and yet having an abortion is completely benign. And I thought, there's something wrong with this. And so as we were going through this lecture, she was sharing some statistics that were from sources like UpToDate. And as you know, this is like Google for doctors. It's actually not that credible. She wasn't even giving good, credible sources and that sort of thing. And I'm kind of going, what's going on? And then when I'm in the middle of this lecture, I realize, wait a second, I haven't really even learned anything about the surgical abortion procedure itself. This is very weird. I'm in a medical school. We're supposed to be talking about medical procedures. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. I'm so sorry. What are some language things that you think are helpful? And what are some ways that you encourage truthful speech about medicine that's in your practice?
There's so much I could say. I like was writing down as you were speaking like all the things. We should be talking to one of these things for a really long time. I guess I would agree that like I think of my friend Robbie George at Princeton, right, who says like our job is to be truth seekers and truth speakers, and we tell the truth. And even the word of like provider versus professional. And I think of medical professionals like we are in a profession. Like, what do you profess? Like, what do you profess with your language, the way that you act? And I think it's interesting to think of this language around the prenatal child and how, right, when the baby is wanted, it's like, let's check your baby. When's your baby shower? But also when the baby's not wanted, it's like the fetus, the conception, products of pregnancy, right? And I'd say we would never say like, when is your fetal shower? Right? It's always a baby shower because the baby's wanted, right? And I was like, and I'll somebody say, like, isn't it so interesting how we have this language that shifts, right? Why do we do that? Right? We've talked about asking questions to your conversation partner. So I think asking questions, but the most powerful thing is like actually speak about persons. Because I mean, person is a metaphysical concept, but that concept is strangely absent within medicine. And I think of the work of Abraham Heschel, who said, like, medicine shouldn't be this impersonal practice on sick bodies, but a personal practice on ill persons. And so what would it mean to reclaim that language on personhood and human dignity and prenatal child and such? So speak the truth. Someone said speaking the truth is like a revolutionary act. The other thing I would say about that, around sort of moral diversity, viewpoint diversity, to point you towards a resource. I don't think I was out when I shared my resources. My colleague Ben Frush and I just published a piece in Perspectives in Medicine Biology out of Johns Hopkins University Press on moral diversity for medical trainees. And in the piece, we talk about like, what does it look like to actually welcome medical trainees who have used still within liberty's window and contested issues like abortion? How would you speak about these things within the very challenging hierarchy of like you're attending and you having maybe different perspectives on a position maybe that's legal in the province where you live. So I'll point you also to that article for further information about how to do that well.
Thank you for your talk, Kristin. I'm a family physician also, and I found your talk very refreshing and hopeful. And I can see it certainly in terms of the relation around positiveness of human life. And some of the work that I've done has been around exercise medicine, and there have been Framingham studies showing that a mother who is exercising while pregnant, whether she exercises afterwards or not, their children have an exercise predisposition. But my question is about intergenerational trauma and the emotional translation that can happen during pregnancy also. So the negative parts of our pregnancy, how does that affect relational biology?
Like even Rachel, your lecture that you got talking about the real risks of pregnancy, like we don't want to downplay also as we're being authentic, right, truth speakers, the realities of the lament that we have about things like this. And also the like bad job that we do with like maternal mortality and how pregnancy is oftentimes a very risky proposition in all the ways, spiritually, emotionally, physically for women. And also, right, we need to do a better job at maternal health outcomes. Our response to that shouldn't be an impoverished model of healthcare where we, reduce suffering by limiting the sufferer, right? But yes, we recognize these things, and I care about these things too. Interconnectedness. I also want to work on trauma, right, informed care, and thinking about support structures for moms and babies, and to work on maternal health outcomes. So I think when we downplay those realities or don't express our lament over those things or try to gloss over them as pro-lifers, people will know that there's something inauthentic about that, and our entire message will be devalued and delegitimized. So yes, we need to recognize the reality of that, and also that's again a beautiful but also sorrowful example of the reality of how we are so. So thank you for bringing that up.
Hi, Thomas from Calgary. Thanks for the wonderful lecture. I wondered if you had an opportunity to see any articles on placenta phagy and the ethics of placenta phagy, because I've looked for a long time and I haven't found any one of these.
Well, no, I mean, there's so in all this disclosure also, I didn't say I'm not an obstetrician gynecologist. I'm an internist, actually. I'm not sure why I end up speaking about these topics. I think they're beautiful. They're a little out of my, when I gave a talk at APOG last year, which is the American Association of OB-GYNs. And I recognize I'm not fully in my lane here. But no, I think that's a fascinating concept. And I think there are people who obviously specialize more so in sort of placental studies and placenta phagy. But I really can't point you to anything because it's not something that I've read a ton about, but it's very interesting. I agree. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have to say it was a talk that I wish I had in medical school because of how moving it was. And it was many years of training. I don't really hear about clinicians often presented with such sense of awe and wonder about the miracle of life and pregnancy and birth. So I'm a resident in child psychiatry, and when we do developmental history, we often start by using the story about conception with the child, with a planned pregnancy, unplanned pregnancy. And I find it especially tragic when there's this story of a rejection of the child sort of throughout their life, and even starting from the pregnancy. So I'm kind of curious, how would you respond to a colleague maybe who has this belief about every baby should be a wanted baby, or maybe a mother who's struggling with the decision about abortion?
Yeah, again, I think that speaks to the reality of acknowledging the fallenness of the world that we live in, and sort of lament the fact that not every baby is wanted and children grow up in horrible situations. But again, our response to that, I always think about what is the appropriate response to poverty, to an unwanted pregnancy? When should our response ever be well, our response should be to kill that child? killing ever an appropriate response to any situation? And really the answer that we use that answer really should be almost never, except like life of the mother, that kind of thing. But like that response is an impoverished response. And also again, recognizing these are horrible things. And we know that abortion practices horrible stuff, right? It's the partner violence, gender-based violence. And like, again, as pro-lifers, I care deeply about those things. And also we need to do a better job, as Quentin talked about, of having community to come around people to support people who find themselves in situations like this that are so horrific. I think if we downplay, like, everything will be fine, everything actually might not be fine, right? Like, so we can't sort of use platitudes. I think sometimes we're tempted to do because we want to make it seem like it's better than it is to get people to agree that this is all fine. Actually, like, so much of it's not fine. And I think about as a newer Christian, I was baptized in 2016, and I also wish I had had the realities of what I just talked to you about, like, for my entire life, which I didn't have. And I think as a physician and as a newer Christian, the identity of Jesus that resonates the most with me is actually man of sorrows. You know, he's acquainted with grief, and that is easy. So I'm acquainted with that grief. You know, I speak about that as a reality in the world, and also thinking about what does an appropriate response to that look like. Not, I think, I don't mean to use this word lightly, but almost a lazy approach of killing. So I think that is like a temptation from a society that, again, thinking about the riches of the society that we have, we should be able to have a more creative, beautiful, and empathetic response to the lament that we have, instead of one that eliminates the sufferer as we want to eliminate suffering. That should not be our response. So thank you for, again, acknowledging the lament in the care that we have here.
Oh, yeah, I can ask a question, but I'm just kind of, anyways. So I was wondering, with the relational biology, if you could speak to the impact of surrogacy in that relationship.
That's a spicy question. So as someone who used to be like militantly like pro-choice, pro-euthanasia, pro-surrogacy, I had this idea that like, gosh, if it's like people consent to it and it doesn't hurt anyone else, like what's the problem, right? And now I see surrogacy actually as like really a situation that we should as Christians be speaking out against, as we shouldn't ever be in favor of selling women's bodies as kind of, we shouldn't be in the business or supporting commodification of women and their bodies. And the commodification of women and their bodies that comes through the practice of commercial surrogacy, oftentimes, as you know, affects women who, as true feminists, we should especially have a preferential option for women who are on the margins, either because of financial vulnerability or other coercion. And they feel like they are at the service then of the privileged elite who literally are renting their rooms, right? And I think here, just to point you to this work, I'm sure you know her work, but just to the crowd, the work of Katie Faust, who runs like Them Before Us. She's in the United States. And Katie's whole thing is like, someone has to do hard things. And it's those hard things are either going to be on adults, or if the adults don't do the hard things, the children are going to end up bearing that burden of the hard things. So she'll say, right, and it's in this conversation of us acknowledging, right, that like infertility is really hard. It is very hard not to be able to have like a biological child of your own. But that doesn't then say that we should be able to rent a woman's womb, right, and take that baby who has a right to their biological mother and father and separate that bond, right, through a transaction. Because Katie will say, and I've come to agree with this too, that when we start seeing not only women and their bodies as commodities, but babies as commodities to be bought and sold, that lends itself to this shaping of the cultural imaginary around babies as products that we can choose, and eugenics and IVF and selection of this and that and that. And then people are like, what? Are we all commodities? And that viewpoint is shaped by the very practices that we allow and that we stamp with our stamp of approval as Christians also, right? IVF, surrogacy, and such. So surrogacy, I have come to see in not a positive light as I used to, because of now how I see really the affront to the human dignity of both the baby and the biological mother that comes through our commodification of them in a system of capitalism. Like,
So I wanted to follow up because that wasn't really my question. I didn't mean to go all spicy on you. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
No, I was thinking more about
a reason. Okay.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking more about the relation. Like we have this relation between the mother and the baby, and how fruitful it is for
Yes.
both.
Yes.
But what happens when they're separated at birth and then the baby never hears the mother's voice again and
Yes.
never hears,
Yes.
has that contact
Yes.
with this person that she or he's been fundamentally attached to for 9 months? Is there biologic or like research around the impact it has on the child?
Yeah, and I don't know that research. I think Katie does collect some of that research about children who, for whatever reason, right, that they're not with their biological mother and father. And most of her research that I've heard her speak on is more qualitative research looking at interviews with children who, for some reason, are not with their mother and their father, and how they have like this longing for, even though they may have actually a very stable adoptive family or a very stable family otherwise that's come around them, that they have this longing of like of being with the person with whom they came from. So she has some qualitative research around that. I don't know if they've looked at these objective outcomes of other things, but yes, I mean, I think we can't deny the fact through, especially through Katie Faust's research about the importance of this connection between the biological mother and child. And if that is disrupted for whatever reason, that there are some sequela of that speak to that brokenness of this bond that was supposed to be there that is no longer. So again, I would point to Katie's sort of qualitative work around the interviews that she has with children who are not with their parents. I agree. Yes, yes, that there's been some sort of data to show that relationship being severed leads to sort of worse subjective and maybe objective outcomes. Realizing how hard that is to talk about.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Kai. I'm a family physician in Vancouver. So we know epidemiologically that women who have more children, they live longer. Is there specific biomechanical and genetic mechanisms behind that?
So that is so interesting. And I don't know. I mean, I again think about, when we think about breast cancer risk, I sort of mentioned that, right, about how women who have had more pregnancies, like most of those women have like a less risk of breast cancer compared to women who've never had a pregnancy. And is that in part because of interruption of cycles with lactation and breastfeeding? Is that secondary to fetomaternal microchimerism? Possibly. So again, I think it'd be great to be alive, like right several decades from now, and more of these like beautiful studies come out again that point to the reality of what we know to be true, that there's a relational construct. Not to sort of hide, right, some of the reality of this. Some of the studies from fetomaternal microchimerism have shown maybe an increased risk of maybe some autoimmune diseases in women who have had multiple children. And again, like just not putting like my lens on that, but just again, there's more and more biological or whatever you want to call that scientific data to show that we are connected and these connections affect us. And like what that means or how we frame that and what lens we use on that, it will be interesting. But yes, I think part of that is some of these researchers think is part secondary to the baby cells in her mother. Yes, it's a good question. We have time for another question over here. Yeah. Hello. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for your talk today. I'm Maria, I'm a second year medical student. And as you briefly just addressed it in your question, I was thinking about, I've done a bit of research on fetomaternal microchimerism, and I've seen a lot of conflicting information of like how protective it is on the mother's health. And like as you mentioned, it can also increase your risk of certain autoimmune diseases.
Yeah.
So I was curious, like what your perspective is, because I always want to share this concept to my classmates and my colleagues, and then I'm like a little hesitant because as soon as I do a little bit of research, it's like all of like so much of what I find is so it's just I don't know, it's a little daunting, and it's a little like I don't want to give off the impression that there's such a huge evolutionary advantage in fetal microchimerism when we don't really know what negative impacts it has in the long run for maternal health.
Yeah, I think a couple things come to mind there. I guess number one, I think then, not worrying too much about defending what is real. I mean, just sort of like talking about it and not putting a lens on it. Like I'm always, whenever I think about some of these topics, like as a Christian person, like I don't have to sort of defend God's goodness. I'm just going to let the reality of what it is be. And I think, again, the reality, if we just didn't even like interpret, right, what the meaning of all this is at a disease level, but just at this like human level, can we just talk more about how we're all interconnected? And isn't that amazing? Like we're still trying to figure it out, but isn't it amazing actually that like baby cells like live in her mother? Literally, the baby cells are integrated in her tissue, and like we're still trying to figure it out, which is true. But like, isn't it amazing that we're connected in this way? That reality by itself is beautiful for its own right. And I don't have to like think of that as like some scientist that I need to explain or give some rationale or defend, whatever. that by itself is so beautiful. If we just got that out there and could acknowledge that we're all connected, that would be like amazingly ahead of like where we are. So like, let's just start there. Don't be afraid that like if you had to bring it up, you had to like defend it or explain it or hide or turn it. You don't have to. I think even if we just had the conversation that this is a reality, I think that by itself is an interesting enough conversation that isn't there, that itself could be just worthwhile talking about in its own right.
Just gonna add one thing to that with the students and residents here. If there's something that you hear or that you're passionate about or that you want to introduce into your classroom or small groups with professors, a really excellent way of doing that is by introducing a paper or a group of papers. Okay, because then you depersonalize it. You're not the defender of things that none of us know everything about. You make it about the content of the paper and you guys can discuss it. That is an extremely important part of medicine and medical education. We need to be able to wrestle with these things because there's nobody in this room that has all of this figured out. And when you do that, you don't set yourself up as the adversary to your colleagues. It's one of the most important things in pro-life ethic that we're going to talk about at some point, I'm sure. It's already come up a little bit, is this posture of extreme collegiality. We are not here to be anyone's enemy. If we are truly pro-lifers who have a pro-life ethic, then we are deeply respectful, not just to people with addictions, not just to babies that aren't born yet, but with everyone who disagrees with us and holds different beliefs. We recognize their beauty and their value as well. Okay, so that's a really important place to start. And the value of using the papers is because you don't have to set yourself up as any kind of adversary. Okay? Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. And let's give it up for Kristin and Kylie.